The end of World War II marked not only the cessation of active combat but the beginning of an era of uncertainty for the military forces that had once shaped the course of the conflict. The Japanese Imperial Navy, a force that had dominated the Pacific with its formidable fleet of battleships, found itself abruptly dissolved, its assets rendered surplus to the post-war needs of a defeated nation. The battleships that had once represented the apex of naval power now faced a future shaped by economic collapse, international pressure, and the slow unraveling of military infrastructure. What happened to Japan's surviving battleships after the Imperial Navy dissolved is a story of loss, abandonment, and the cold calculus of a nation trying to recover from the devastation of war. By August 1945, Japan's once proud fleet of battleships had been reduced to a mere shadow of its former self. Throughout the war, battleships like the Yamato, Musashi, and Nagato had been symbols of Japanese naval dominance, representing both the might and the pride of the Imperial Navy. However, with Japan's surrender, these ships, along with several others, had become relics of a bygone era, irrelevant in a world that was rapidly shifting its focus toward aircraft carriers and submarines. For the Japanese government, the immediate priority was survival, economic recovery, rebuilding a shattered infrastructure, and dealing with the occupation forces. The battleships, along with the rest of the Imperial Navy, had no place in this new reality. The scale of the post-war challenge facing Japan was staggering. The Japanese economy had been crippled by years of total war. Cities lay in ruins, the population had been decimated by both combat and starvation, and the country was under strict occupation by Allied forces. The United States, under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, had been given the task of overseeing Japan's reconstruction. As part of this process, a series of decisions had to be made about what to do with the remnants of the imperial military. The focus was on disarmament and demilitarization, and the battleships, along with other warships, were to be dismantled. At the time of Japan's surrender, battleships were still in various stages of repair or disrepair. The Yamato, the largest and most famous of these ships, had been sunk in April 1945 during the Battle of Okinawa, but its remains remained an important symbol of the Imperial Navy. The Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, had met a similar fate, also sunk in 1944, leaving only two major battleships left in Japanese hands, the Nagato and the Matsu. The Nagato, which had been Japan's flagship during the war, was docked at the Kure Naval Arsenal, far from the front lines but still symbolically important. The ship had been heavily damaged by American bombers in 1945, and after the surrender, it was no longer viable as a warship. The Matsu, similarly damaged, was in a state of disrepair at the time of Japan's capitulation. Both ships were effectively useless as combat vessels, but they were large, expensive, and powerful symbols of Japan's naval pride. The task at hand for the post-war government was to determine what to do with these giant structures. In the months following Japan's surrender, the initial response was one of abandonment. The Imperial Navy was disbanded, its officers either demobilized or interned. The Japanese people, already grappling with the trauma of defeat, were not concerned with the fate of these hulking ships, which had become symbols of a lost cause. The ships languished in port, with no clear instructions on how to proceed. This moment of stillness, where the future of the battleships hung in the balance, was defined by the sheer scale of the problem. The battleships were too large, too costly, and too symbolic to simply scrap overnight, yet they no longer had a role to play in the post-war world. At the same time, the Allied forces, primarily the United States, began to make their own demands. As part of the broader process of demilitarization, the United States sought to ensure that Japan would never again pose a military threat. This meant dismantling not only the Navy but also all other aspects of Japan's war-making potential. As a result, the Nagato and Matsu were not long for this world. For a time, it appeared that both ships might simply be abandoned. The Japanese government, under the constraints of its new occupation, struggled to keep up with the overwhelming demands of reconstruction. The Navy's dissolution had created a power vacuum, and the government's priority was rebuilding the country's civilian infrastructure. The fate of the battleships would be determined not by military necessity, but by economics and geopolitics. The Nagato and Matsu were kept afloat, but they were effectively inactive, no longer symbols of power but of stagnation. Both ships were located in the Kure Naval Arsenal, a facility that had been heavily damaged during the war but was now being used to repair and store ships in various states of readiness. The economic pressures on the country were immense. The cost of maintaining such massive vessels, with their crews and supplies, was simply unsustainable in the post-war context. Japan was under occupation and heavily reliant on foreign aid, particularly from the United States, which had taken the lead in managing the nation's reconstruction. The ships, which had once symbolized the peak of Japanese naval technology, were now an economic burden. The military-industrial complex that had once built and maintained them had crumbled, and the country's resources were better allocated to rebuilding the civilian economy. However, dismantling a battleship was not a simple task. The Nagato and Mutsu were still immensely valuable in terms of raw materials, and their scrap metal could be repurposed for the rebuilding effort. Yet, even the act of scrapping such ships would be expensive, requiring a significant investment in time and labor. With Japan's resources stretched thin, it became clear that the battleships could not be preserved, nor could they be allowed to remain as symbols of the old Imperial Navy. The initial phase of post-war decision-making, marked by hesitation and a lack of clear direction, soon gave way to more definitive actions. As the Allied occupation authorities solidified their control over Japan, they began to implement their disarmament policies more aggressively. For the Japanese government, this meant complying with the terms of surrender, which included the complete dissolution of the military, including the battleships. These ships, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, were now seen as liabilities, both as military threats and as financial burdens. By the end of 1945, it was clear that Japan's surviving battleships would not be repaired or repurposed for any military function. They were too costly to maintain and too obsolete in the face of the changing nature of naval warfare. The remaining battleships, now caught between the demands of international disarmament and the realities of a nation trying to rebuild, faced a grim future. Would they be scrapped? Abandoned? Repurposed for another purpose? As 1946 began, the true fate of Japan's surviving battleships started to unfold. The Nagato and Mutsu were now relics of a bygone era, their enormous size and military significance overshadowed by the pressing need for economic recovery and reconstruction. The ships, once symbols of Japan's military might, now faced a quiet, inevitable decline. For the Japanese government, the decision to dispose of them was not taken lightly, but the economic pressures were overwhelming. The country was in the grip of a fragile recovery, with its economy shattered by years of war, and the battleships, with their outdated technology, had little to offer in the face of modern industrial needs. By 1947, a series of decisions were made that would seal the fate of these naval giants. The Nagato, which had served as the flagship of the Imperial Navy, was deemed too costly to repair or maintain. Though it had survived the war in relatively good condition, its usefulness as a military asset was long gone. The Japanese government, under pressure from the Allied occupation forces, faced an insurmountable task of demilitarization. The Mutsu, a sister ship to the Nagato, had also suffered severe damage during the war, and its repairs were too expensive to justify. With both ships now considered surplus, the focus turned to their disposal, and by early 1947, the wheels of decommissioning were set into motion. The first step in dismantling the ships was the removal of all military equipment and weaponry. The heavy guns, once capable of firing 16-inch shells with devastating force, were removed, along with the advanced fire control systems and armor plating. These components, though valuable for scrap, could no longer be used in a modern naval context. For Japan, this represented a further loss of military capability. The battleships had been the backbone of its naval defense, but now they were stripped of everything that had once made them formidable. The Allied forces, particularly the United States, supervised much of this process, ensuring that all traces of military capability were erased. Once the weaponry was removed, the next step was to prepare the ships for scrapping. This was not a simple task. Both the Nagato and Mutsu were massive vessels, each over 700 feet in length and displacing more than 30,000 tons. Their sheer size meant that the process of dismantling them was slow, requiring specialized facilities and skilled labor. The Kure naval arsenal, which had once been a hub of military activity, was now a center for the decommissioning of Japan's warships. The shipyard, though damaged during the war, was repurposed for this task. However, even here, the resources were limited. Japan was still struggling to rebuild its infrastructure, and the cost of dismantling such enormous vessels drained already scarce resources. The work of scrapping the ships was methodical and grim. The battleships were broken down piece by piece, with the metal being sold off to be repurposed for civilian industries. Much of the steel was melted down and used to rebuild the country's railroads, factories, and other infrastructure. In this way, the remains of the Nagato and Mutsu were transformed from symbols of military might into the raw material for Japan's post-war recovery. For many, the destruction of these ships marked the end of an era, a period when naval power had defined national identity. Now, those very ships were being dismantled to help rebuild a country that had once used them to project power across the Pacific. Yet, even as the process of dismantling continued, there was resistance to the idea of scrapping these monumental ships. For some, the Nagato and Mutsu were symbols of Japan's lost glory. These battleships had served as the pinnacles of Japanese naval engineering, and their destruction represented not just the loss of military assets but the erasure of a proud legacy. There were those who argued that the ships should be preserved as historical artifacts, monuments to the sacrifices made during the war. Some even advocated for turning them into museums or memorials, so that future generations could understand the history of the Imperial Navy. However, these arguments were ultimately ignored. The priority for the Japanese government was to move forward, not dwell on the past. The battleships, with their towering superstructures and immense firepower, were symbols of a war that Japan had lost. The future lay in rebuilding the country's economy, not in preserving military monuments. The final blow to the Nagato and Mutsu came in the form of international pressure. The United States, which had been overseeing Japan's occupation and reconstruction, had no interest in preserving Japan's military heritage. Under the terms of the post-war peace settlement, Japan was required to disarm completely, and the remnants of its military forces, including these battleships, were seen as impediments to the country's demilitarization. The Allied powers, particularly the U.S., were determined that Japan would never again pose a military threat. The battleships, along with the remaining warships in Japan's fleet, were seen as symbols of a military past that had no place in the new order of post-war Asia. In 1947, both the Nagato and Mutsu were officially decommissioned. The Nagato was removed from the naval registry, its place in history relegated to the status of a broken vessel. The ship, which had once been the pride of the Imperial Navy, was now nothing more than a hulking mass of steel, awaiting its final fate. The Mutsu, similarly, was marked for scrapping. What had once been a state-of-the-art battleship was now reduced to a collection of metal parts, no longer capable of serving any military function. In the following years, the dismantling of the Nagato and Mutsu continued. The ships were slowly disassembled, their remains sold off for scrap. By 1948, both battleships had been reduced to nothing more than fragments. The once imposing structures were gone, replaced by piles of metal that would serve Japan's rebuilding efforts. The cost of maintaining them had simply been too great, and with the country in desperate need of every available resource, the battleships were sacrificed in the name of recovery. While the battleships were being scrapped, other parts of Japan's naval heritage were quietly disappearing. The Kure naval arsenal, once a major center of military shipbuilding, was gradually transformed into a civilian shipyard. The remnants of the Imperial Navy, scattered across the country, were quietly decommissioned, their equipment either sold off or destroyed. For the Japanese people, the memories of the war were still fresh, and the removal of the battleships was not just the loss of military assets, but a symbolic end to an era of national pride. In the end, the fate of Japan's surviving battleships, once powerful symbols of military might, was one of quiet dissolution. They were dismantled, repurposed, and sold off for scrap, their remnants becoming part of the country's fragile post-war recovery. What had once been the pinnacle of naval engineering became little more than raw material for rebuilding a nation. The battleships Nagato and Mutsu were consigned to history, Their final moments marked not by the roar of their guns or the clash of battle, but by the quiet hum of industrial machines tearing them apart, piece by piece. Japan's surviving battleships had met the cold calculus of history. They were no longer necessary in the New World Order, and their value as symbols of military power was diminished in the face of a nation that had to look to the future, not the past. The surviving battleships were swept away by the tide of post-war reconstruction, fading from the memory of the Japanese people as quickly as the nation sought to rebuild itself. Their destruction, though inevitable, was not a moment of triumph or victory. It was the final act in the death of a symbol, a testament to a nation's defeat and the reality of its new circumstances.